Hello and welcome to Counterculture. I am Peter Whittle. Now, last week, the Home Secretary Priti Patel declared that so-called non-crime hate incidents should no longer be recorded by the police. Now, this comes after a period when people's confidence in the police and indeed the role of the police has been a matter of controversy, whether it's about hate crime or indeed whether it's about the way in which various different protests have been policed over the past year. There does seem to be a crisis of confidence, public confidence in the police. We're going to be discussing this today, and I'm very, very pleased that we have the guests that we have today. Harry Miller, who has been on the channel before. He is a former police officer, won a landmark case against homicide police, and he is part of the campaign We Are Fair Cop, and the NCF's own historian and commentator, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Can I start with asking you, actually, Harry? You obviously were on our channel some time ago, and there was an incident which became very famous, actually. You took the police to court. They came to you and said, we need to check your thinking. This was about something which, in fact, you had just, I think you just liked on Twitter. But in that context, what is the significance of what Priti Patel has announced, and what is the status of it?
Okay, so in 2019, Humberside Police sent a police officer to my place of work to check my thinking as a result of tweeting things which somebody somewhere didn't like. We battled it out with Humberside and ended up at the High Court in judicial review. Now, Humberside Police claimed right the way through that they had approached me and recorded me for non-crime hate incidents because they were following the guidance laid out by the College of Policing. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that the College of Policing didn't argue. The College of Policing put no distance at all between their guidance and Humberside's interpretation of the guidance. None whatsoever. So we found it very strange when the High Court ruled that the guidance itself was legal, but following the guidance was illegal. We said that was fundamentally irrational. And as a result, we were back at the Court of Appeal in March against the College of Policing. And we're now in the position where we're waiting a ruling. Now, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, is the sole shareholder and owner of the College of Policing, because the College of Policing is a private limited company set up, I think, in around about 2012. And its role is nominally to be the professional body for the police service of England and Wales. So we have this bizarre situation now where the owner of the College of Policing has come out before the ruling and said that she wants to get rid of non-crime hate incidents and abolish the 120,000 non-crime hate incidents that have been recorded against. They're not all against me, but against me and I'm presuming 120,000 others. Yeah. So it's quite odd, and that she has preempted the ruling and has preempted it in our favour.
How would you describe most simply what a non-crime hate incident is?
Yeah, a non-crime hate incident is any incident which falls short of being a crime, but is nevertheless perceived by somebody as being an incident inspired by hatred. Now, what's worrying about that is that, one, there doesn't need to be an incident. Okay, when you think about an incident, you naturally think of some argy-bargy or something or other. In my case, and in many cases, there was no incident. All there was me expressing a view. Yeah. And I expressed a view around proposed reforms to the Gender Recognition Act, which in fact the government had asked for. So some of the things that I tweeted were, for instance, who won the 1976 men's decathlon at the Olympics? Well, the answer is Bruce Jenner. But because he's now Caitlyn Jenner, this was perceived as being having a go at trans people. Simply asking question was recorded as being indicative of hate, and that hate was indicative of future criminality on my part. So Humberside Police, following the College of Policing guidelines, took the view that it was necessary intervention. In other words, that unless they came and challenged my thinking, that it would likely escalate into some form of criminality. So that's what a non-crime hate incident is. But again, crucially, it's all down to perception. So if somebody simply perceives that I'm motivated by hatred, that's all the police need. They don't need any evidence whatsoever. In fact, the College of Policing guidance says no evidence of hate is required.
This is extraordinary, isn't it, Rafe? I mean, basically no evidence. This is, I think, makes it unique in English law, actually. There is no evidence required for this, just subjective perception.
Exactly. It's the latest attack. The other one, of course, famously now is the lack of mens rea. One doesn't need to actually have any intent now to be convicted of many of these sorts of hate crimes, which goes against every aspect of the common law tradition. And Harry's completely right in everything he says. Now, some people obviously are welcoming Priti Patel finally taking a stance on such an issue, but it's risible that it's taken 10 years for a Conservative government to actually get its house in order and at least try to address this in some capacity. And the problem is the College of Policing, which quite rightly was said, is a private company. And the plan still seems to be, as far as I'm aware, that the government intends to turn this into an independent statutory body, which will have even more authority and power and be more difficult to control. And this is a body which is not enforcing legislation. This is guidance, which is severely lobbied by pressure groups like Stonewall and others, who are influencing the College of Policing, who are together creating this guidance, which is then enforced, and you have this bizarre situation where the courts are supporting a lobbied guidance as if it were law. And that seems to me to be a major problem here. I mean, it's the College of Policing that would classify anybody who complained about a tweet from Harry as being the victim, irrespective of where they lived in the world, and Harry is the suspect, automatically criminalizing individuals. It's the College of Policing that really is at the heart of all of this, and I would much rather see Priti Patel tackling the College of Policing on this point.
Yes, it is a sort of the College of Policing, a private company, but who are these people actually, Harry? I mean, you know, who technically, how many, who is it?
We know how many, because one of the great things about it being a private company is that its accounts are downloadable at Companies House. And we did that a few weeks ago, and it's incredible. The first thing that strikes you is that most company accounts are about 9 or 10 pages long. There's a little bit of preamble, then there's the numbers and a conclusion, and that's it. Theirs is 100 pages long. And the figures are buried deep, deep, deep within it. And I'm not surprised, because it turns out that they do, I don't know, I think it's, if I remember rightly, about £10 million worth of actual work, in other words, invoiced work, providing training, setting exams, etc. But they've got costs of over 50 million. They've got a wage bill of 38 million. And they've got 650 employees. Now, if you do the maths, that works out at a crude average of £56,000 per employee. Now, the average wage of a constable in this country is around about 28,000. So for every one College of Policing employee, you could have 2 police constables. And what do? We've absolutely no idea what they do. I call them a hate factory, the national hate factory, because it seems to me that the only thing that they do is think up new, more numerous ways of generating hate. They set courses for police officers, and police officers then go out and tell people how to recognise hate. And hate is defined, bizarrely again, as antagonism, unfriendliness, dislike, ill will. In other words, everyday human emotions have been classified by these lunatics at the College of Policing as being hateful, as being hostility. And then from that position, they say that if you express anything and anybody thinks that you're motivated by ill will, dislike, antagonism, then that classes as hate. And therefore, there is a justification to send a police officer to your door, or at the very least, to record you on a database of hate. We say that is fundamentally wrong. It's evil. It's undemocratic. We live in a democracy, and our democracy is predicated on the notion of antagonism. You have an idea, I don't like it, we have a stand-up row or a sit-down row, and we eventually work it out. Well, under the College of Policing guidance, the antagonism that is just a natural process of disagreement and is to be celebrated in a democracy has been de facto criminalised.
There's a problem also that, the idea that things are going to get any better is for the birds, unless the government takes steps here, because the College of Policing has now made it a requirement as of last year for all future police to have a university degree. It's a prerequisite and a requirement. Now, at the current time, there's a hope, at least, or a thinking that the majority of police have enough common sense to know that a lot of the nonsense they hear from their executive and their elites is complete nonsense. Once you've got generation after generation coming up through the university system being indoctrinated by the College of Policing's courses, as you've seen in our universities as well, you can only see this problem growing exponentially. It's a huge problem arising unless this government takes it into hand.
I think yes, exactly. The point you make as well about what hate means, or they have widened it, and it's basically widening, isn't it? So as you say, now it's sort of dislike and everything. But the point is surely this is a problem of the legal system, not specifically the police, is it not? I mean, it's Parliament and it's the legal system that enshrines hate laws. The police presumably just have to enforce them.
Well, no, that's not true, is it? Because we don't really have hate laws in this country. What we have at the moment is an uplift at sentencing if it can be shown that a criminal action was motivated by hatred towards a particular group. And I think that whilst it's problematic, I can see the sense in it. For instance, if I were to attack somebody who is a Jew and thump them in the face, then that's terrible on a personal level for them. If I attack them because they are a Jew, or because they are a Muslim, or because they are a woman, and if the purpose is not only to hurt them, but to send a message throughout their entire community that because of your characteristic, it could be you, then I can see some sense in uplifting at sentence if you're found guilty of that.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but that's the solution. You don't need to have hate crime laws which actually identify specific groups, because once you start to identify specific groups, you've left out other groups who will then feel as if they're being hard done by. For example, take the situation of a Jew walking down the street who's punched because he's a Jew, and then there's a fat kid or a ginger kid who's punched because he's a fat kid or a ginger kid. Now both get severe injuries, identical injuries. How would you think this chap would feel knowing that this person got more of the culprit got more of a sentence because of the fact that this person was Jewish? Rather than doing that the old traditional way, this goes back, 60 years when there were 4 teddy boys in Notting Hill who attacked any black person that they saw. And the judge at the time said, you are free to think whatever you want. You are free to say whatever you want. You are free to get enraged inside. But once you act upon that, then you will have aggravating sentences put onto you. And so you don't need to identify groups. You can just say at the time of sentencing, and put that upswing in there, and say that there are aggravating causes here, whether you are fat or ginger or a Jew, is irrespective of that.
I think the problem is, though, surely, is that, you say that you can see a logic in that situation, but isn't the whole problem with this is that it's entirely on the perception of the supposed victim? I mean, that one surely could have, what you would prefer, i.e. that, that there is a situation where you're punching a Jewish person because they're Jewish or whatever, but it's entirely, the whole problem seems to rise, it's entirely on the perception of that person.
Well, I think that what we need to have is that the burden of proof remains with the state, that there remains a presumption of innocence. And even if you're found guilty of a crime against person B, who happens to be Jewish or Muslim or what have you, I think that you're still required to then prove that in that attack there was meant to be a wider chilling effect before you're justified in an uplift of sentence. Now, it's quite a high bar to reach, but that's for the state to sort out. I don't think we can drop our standards and just simply go with perception when we start sentencing people.
Do you think there's a general problem about with the whole notion of policing by consent, which is how we do it? This is going right back to Robert Peel, isn't it? Do you think we still have policing by consent?
Well, this is actually the fundamental issue, isn't it? Because the public pay the wages of the police. Our police force is very different to many of the forces you see in Europe, which are paramilitary forces. If you go to Italy and elsewhere, if you go to the French, you have two police forces. One is a paramilitary force. Our police force are traditionally citizens in uniform. And the whole principle there is that they are enforcing laws without fear or favour. It was the fifth rule of Sir Robert Peel's policing, was that you apply the law equally and impartially to everybody there. And when they see things like this, when they see things like protests, the double standards of multi-tiered policing, it offends that idea of natural justice. It offends that idea of fairness. And we've come a long way from Dixon of Dog Green. Older viewers may remember the old policemen in the 60s bicycling. The local constabulary had control of deciding what to do, whether you get a clip around the ear roll or whether you get a night behind bars. That's all gone now. And what people are seeing is, in many respects, it's because of the Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Act incorporated the European Convention into it, and it still remains part of our law now, which gives, for example, the police a lot of leeway in deciding whether or not to get involved in certain protests. And once you start doing that, you're politicizing an institution. And once you politicize an institution, you immediately divide the population. And once you divide the population, you dissolve those two fundamental pillars, trust and legitimacy, because the public need to be assured that what's being done is lawful, just, and is necessary. And in terms of things like the hate crime incidents, there's no concept of that whatsoever. I could critique the person living next to me on Twitter and say, look at this messy bugger's junk in his front garden. And because he's Chinese, the person across the street could report me for having committed a hate crime. I may never have seen the person in my life. Now that offends people. And that's why you're seeing policing at a very low level. Because, as I said, at the end of the day, what do we want? The British public know that all of this is nonsense. The British public wants policemen to catch burglars, to catch robbers, put them in jail, and if their car is stolen, to get their car back, rather than not investigating. Whereas you have a 97% chance of getting away with burglary if you commit it. With robbery, it's around 97 or 96%. You've got a 2% chance of getting your car back or seeing someone prosecuted for stealing your car. And yet the College of Policing has identified social media posts as a priority. When you've had, close to 100,000 or 120,000 hate crime incidents, at the same time that violent crime is increasing. And of course the public are looking at this and thinking something is rotten.
Well, you mentioned there, actually, Rafe, this selective policing issue, which I think is really, sort of basically concentrated a lot of people's minds. It's something I've gone on about in London Assembly. But broadly speaking, would you, Harry, agree with? Is it just is it an incorrect perception, or are people right to believe that certain protests seem to be tolerated or treated in a certain way as opposed to others?
Well, actually, the sniff test is not whether they were. The sniff test is whether it looks like they were, because the College of Policing, not the College of Policing guidelines, the Code of Ethics states that policemen should not get involved in politics, nor give the impression of being involved in politics. Now, I think they give the impression of being involved in politics all the time. Now, one of the problems that we have is, I think it's prior to 2002, a new constable would take the oath of attestation and they would swear to the Queen to uphold the law. Since 2002, they swear to uphold the law and human rights. What does that mean? Because the only human rights that a police officer should be enforcing are those that have been adopted by law. And so we have this bizarre situation where all you need to do with a protest is call it a human rights issue, and you've already got the police half on side, because they have committed, they've sworn to the Queen to uphold human rights. So there isn't an objective standard anymore. There's law and human rights.
So, but that's what you just said, isn't it? That these were incorporated, actually, the Human Rights Act.
Under the Human Rights Act. But as I said, in terms of protests, police superintendents and so forth now under the Human Rights Act, because of it's not stated specifically in the legislation, but through court rulings they now have this ability. They can decide whether or not they want to intervene in a protest, and it's a personal subjective choice of theirs. So if they'd like a protest, then you saw this in Cambridge when you had Extinction Rebellion blocking highways. The police there said, well, yes, they have actually blocked the highway. This isn't a criminal act, but they're not causing any. It's a peaceful protest. Now, why are they making the subjective choice when you see what they're doing, for example, to the anti-lockdown protesters, or when you see what they did in Clapham with the Sarah Everard vigil? And there again with Edward Coulston in Bristol, you had the police standing by as the statue was toppled, a clear act of criminal damage, and yet choosing not. Now those are decisions made because of the Human Rights Act.
You see, but I would say there's the human rights. There are human rights which are incorporated into law, and there are human rights which are just tagged as human rights. So you see the police saying trans rights are human rights, black lives are human rights, the Extinction Rebellion thing is a human right matter. So it's very easy to tag human rights onto a protest or an action that's not embodied in law, and suddenly you have a police force that feels as though it's doing its duty by supporting this cause or that cause, even though there is no basis for it in law. That's the problem. So for me, I would absolutely abolish that aspect of the oath of attestation. For me, the litmus test is this. I say, do we know what the Queen thinks about a subject? And if we don't know what Her Majesty thinks about a subject, we don't need to know what a Chief Constable thinks about a subject.
Okay.
That's the test. And that's why every officer swears to the Queen, because it's to do with the separation of powers. And if we don't know what Lizzie thinks, then we don't need to know what the police think. It needs to be as bland and as neutral as that.
Well,
that's an important point. Yeah, sorry.
In which case it's sort of diverged about as far as it can diverge, hasn't it?
The army and the police are servants of the crown, of Her Majesty the Queen, right? The Prime Minister has no control. They're not loyal to the Prime Minister or to the government of the time. But what's happened is not only is everything that Harry said correct, but also you have government targets now influencing police decisions. And the police, rather than protecting the individuals, they're now trying to placate special interest groups and meet government targets and government priorities, which are often at odds with the will of the British public. And so we know from all the polls that Black Lives Matter is not popular in the country. We know from the polls that transgender rights and being an infringement on women's rights is a hot topic which the majority of the public are uncomfortable with. And yet the police are deliberately going against the public vein, and that of course erodes public consent.
Do you actually think, therefore, I mean, you said the perception is all important, and I would agree with you. Do you agree that if you take two examples, the cenotaph, where, for example, Extinction Rebellion on Remembrance Day managed to get right there and stand there for about between 10 and 20 minutes, something like that. And yet only the week after, I believe it was, if memory serves me, there was a woman who was an anti-lockdown protester outside Parliament. She was bundled unceremoniously into the back of a van, and the MP, I think it might have been Charles Walker, made a big deal about it in Sir Charles Walker in Parliament. Now, to me, I'm sorry, that's quite clear. They're both in the same, area.
Yeah.
Those were two different forms of policing. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And it looks political because it is political.
Yeah.
And what they say is that we were just simply making operational decisions. Well, that'll wash now and again. That will wash now and again. But when consistently your operational decisions seem to favour one group over another, then it no longer passes the sniff test. It doesn't. And that's why PCCs, I think it's incumbent on PCCs to haul in their chief constables and say, no more, matey. You are serving the public. Your locus of control is the law and the public. Not Priti Patel, not Stonewall, not anybody. It's the law and it's the public. And unless you shape up, you're getting sacked. The people are going to sack you.
This doesn't actually seem to happen, though, does it? Because, I mean, people can see this sort of very, very clearly. And I think a lot of people, particularly when it comes to the demonstrations, they were just horrified to see policemen taking the knee. I mean, you presumably think they were wrong to take the knee, do you?
Well, for the very same reason that Harry explained, the Queen never takes an opinion, and the entire nation can then support the Queen for that. once you have a political stance, you immediately divide the public. And the police must never be divisive. The police are there for everybody to feel as if they are their champion when they need them. And as soon as you take a position on anything, you immediately alienate people. And that is the most damaging thing you can do. And of course, the monarchy and the police were traditionally two of the greatest institutions that we had in this country. The police were renowned around the world as being the best in the world. If you were a British bobby, the nightmare scenario was you had a German policeman and a British cook, and in the ideal European Union. But having a British policeman was the sort of the golden ticket to policing. And we founded the police force around the world, for example.
I think the thing is, when you mentioned Edward Colston, when the statue went in, I was personally horrified to see, and I can't remember his name, but the quite senior guy who sort of stood by and said, we decided that this was the best course of action, right? Again, you sort of say an operational thing maybe. But in fact, his whole demeanour and manner suggested sympathy with what was going on, this guy. And this was, one was appalled by this, actually. It's almost that they were sort of letting and helping it happen, and I think this is, people can't quite work out, this is the police, you're meant to actually be totally, defending our public monuments.
I'm a big fan of Les Miserables. Right. And in Les Miserables, I'm always rather keen on the character of Javert, the police officer, because he doesn't let emotion overwhelm him. Unless until the very end when he sort of throws himself off a bridge. But he's dedicated to upholding the law. And that guy stole some bread, it's against the law, and I'm going to track him down. That's it, I'm tracking him down. Because this is not personal, this is the law. This is the law. And quite frankly, we want a few more police officers like that. Who are dispassionate. We need to send them all to Les Miserables. Shut down the College of Policing, send them all to see Les Miserables, and then have them back for a seminar and tell them how policing should be. That's what we need to do.
Well, as it stands at the moment, the most common thing I hear, when I was on the Assembly, the same thing was, it's the top brass, the ordinary guys on the beat, if there is a beat, are not like this. They're as demoralised as anybody. I'm not sure whether that I would go along with that.
I still think it's the case for a large portion, but I think the segment who have common sense, let's put it that way, is getting smaller and smaller as time goes on. And I go back to my earlier point of once the College of Policing has said that you have to have a university degree, you're drawing your talent from an entirely different pool, and you're drawing your talent from a group of people who have been through yet another one of these indoctrination camps, essentially. I mean, that's what we're dealing with, let's be honest about it. And so the final end product is very different from the policeman of 20 years ago. I mean, I can only imagine, Regan from the Sweeney having a look at today's police force and seeing it as it is. And it's, as I said, it's the College of Policing is the problem here, and to continue to have them creating the training programs, creating the guidance. I mean, you might as well ask Gary Glitter to write safeguarding for primary schools. I mean, that's basically what we're dealing with at this time,
No, I agree. It's quite interesting, though, because I think the whole push to recruit university graduates is because they want the opposite of critical thinkers. They want people who have the very opposite of common sense. And I know this because after the as we were prodding and poking the cadaver of Humberside's failed defence, I had coffee with the chief constable of Humberside and said, he's a good cop, local cop, rose through the ranks locally, great fella in so many ways. I said, look, Lee, I kind of get why one over-enthusiastic constable got it wrong. I get that. What I don't understand is, as this rose up through the ranks and it became a source of national and international outrage, why did a more senior officer not step in and apply some common sense?
Yeah.
And the chief constable looked me square in the eye and he said, Harry, you've got to understand, common sense is not an appropriate tool for a police officer because common sense leads to unpredictable outcomes. What we need is more guidance. Ooh. I could not believe that he said that without any sense of irony at all. Bearing in mind, following the guidance for him had resulted in his force being likened to the Gestapo. I said to him, I said, but Lee, that doesn't make sense. Most normal people don't need guidance not to behave like the Stasi, the Cheka, and the Gestapo. And here you are wanting more and eschewing common sense. Yeah. It makes no sense. It makes no sense at all.
That's a fundamentally shocking thing to hear.
Yeah,
that the police believe that they are incapable of applying common sense without guidance. And then traditionally, local constabularies were independent, and common sense was their bread and butter. That's how they went about their daily duties.
Well, the thing is, the whole of British law is predicated on common sense, because common law is predicated on common sense, where the state trusts us to do and say what we will up until the point that they specifically say this far and no further. We're not like the Napoleonic Roman countries where they dictate what we can do. We're free to do, free to say, free to think, right up until a specific point. So the very idea that common law is not appropriate when our entire nation is built upon the notion of common sense is ridiculous. And it's causing an absolute schism in society. And it's creating a police force which is becoming simply a servant on who can write the loudest guidance. That is not what policing is about.
And of course, in the common law, the idea that the common law has no place for common sense is ridiculous. It's the reasonable man. It's the man on the omnibus.
Exactly.
Applying common sense rules, or you can call it natural justice.
Yeah.
And when you see things like hate crime incidents, you know that there's no natural justice. You know that there's common sense, and it beggars belief that the police force don't see this or don't see how it's unjust, or don't see how damaging it is. For me, I had seen the long litany of police misconduct and incompetence over the years, but it was in 2018 when I saw the police doing it to themselves in the most jaw-dropping manner, when a police superintendent in charge of anti-corruption was delivering a talk to his crew and told them, being in anti-corruption, they needed to be whiter than white, and he was suspended for making a racist remark. Now, anybody in their right mind knows whiter than white is sort of a Daz Purcell commercial, with Danny, whatever his name is, And yet here was this man who actually had to go off and have his career sullied for God knows how long while he did an investigation. And then you had this black woman who had over 30 years experience in the police. Her sister was concerned about a viral video showing indecent images, and she wanted the perpetrator who created it to be arrested. So she forwarded it to her sister. Her sister didn't request this video. Her sister didn't even open it. And she was arrested and convicted and ended up with a criminal record, had to do a couple of 100 hours of community service for being in possession of an indecent image. This is a senior black woman in the police force.
The problem really, surely, is in this country, as opposed to Europe, there was always this idea that the police had somehow come out of, ordinary people, sort of working class, if you like, class. That's why they've always had a different attitude. It's been very top down in Europe. That is something I feel is not the case anymore. Whether it's because of university degrees or whatever it is, or whether they're more middle class or whatever, there is this sort of a feeling that somehow I don't, for example, feel anymore that the police are on my side particularly. I don't personally feel it. Would you say that the police are the run-of-the-mill police are different to when you were in the force, Harry?
Oh, absolutely, because back in the day, you would be trusted to go out and, patrol your beat and deal with things in a common sense manner. But I would blame Tony Blair for a lot of this, because introducing sort of Blairite managerialism into absolutely every area of society, it's no good anymore to just simply, come across an altercation and sort it out there and then on the street, and then write in your notebooks, 2 people were given advice. That's it. Because you can't account for that. It doesn't fit into a statistic. So now we have the ridiculous situation where in that situation, given exactly the same situation, the police would have to do something. Make an arrest, generate a non-crime hate incident, do something to show what they had done in that time. Because simply trusting them to write it in their notebook doesn't cut the mustard anymore.
No.
Doesn't cut the mustard anymore. I was chatting to Alan Robinson from Thames Valley yesterday, who's standing for PCC. 25 years service. And he said he finally gave up the ghost with policing when he went to attend two blokes who were having a bit of an altercation on the street. And he said back in 1991 or whenever, he'd simply done that. Offered them advice, 20 minutes advice. They would have both gone away with a flea in the rear, and that would have been it. Not allowed to do that anymore because it doesn't generate a statistic. Yeah. So I said, how much time did you spend in total dealing with that incident? He said, well, it was 5 hours of his time, and because they had to drive somewhere, it was 3 hours of another officer's time. So something that should have been sorted in 20 minutes took over 8 hours and left somebody with a criminal record. That is absolute nonsense. And what the College of Policing are insisting is having a bunch of policing robots, robocops, who will come in and simply unthinkingly, uncritically apply guidance. And that's why we say it's fundamentally un-British. Guidance, as far as I'm concerned, is un-British.
And we also can't underestimate the impact that the Mcpherson report into the Stephen Lawrence inquiry
just about
had.
To ask you that.
Well, in 1999, the report came out. Now, undeniably, there were racist elements within the police force and within society at large. Britain is a much more different place today than it was back then. And so there needed to be issues addressed. There needed to be some sort of change or transformation to take place within the police force. But the way in which the police have reacted in subsequent years has been so far to the extreme that it goes beyond any idea of proportionality at all. And there's this idea now where as soon as you make a complaint, you are automatically a victim. It's this idea of victimhood that's seeped into the police force as well. And wanting to be seen to be open and inclusive has become such a mantra that you do have these robocops who are enforcing guidance without any idea of common sense, and who do want to wear the lanyard of pride or take the knee to Black Lives Matter, or indeed to go after anybody who is accused of paedophilia, as with Operation U-Tree, or we saw with the collapsed Westminster paedophile ring, where you had nonsensical accusations being followed up as if they were gospel, when it was patently clear to anybody who heard the allegations that had been made about Edward Heath were obviously fake and false and the product of a diseased mind. To the police, these were, arguments which had credence. These were accusations that needed to be followed up on. And that's because of this blinkered, brainwashed thinking. And it's actually quite scary to me to think that the police of our country actually hold these views or believe that their conduct in all of these cases is something that they don't need to apologise for.
With that Stephen Lawrence example there, to me that is overpowering. That charged institutionalised racism, which we'd never heard actually up until that point about anything. It seems to me that the police's history since then is just characterised by a desire to move as far away from that as possible. That the damage done to general morale was extraordinary. Then, would you agree with that?
Well, it's a false reading of the Mcpherson report.
Yeah,
that's it. It's a willfully false reading, because what Mcpherson was saying is that culturally the police viewed at the time the black community either as perpetrators of crime or complicit in their own victimhood. And what Mcpherson said was that you police officers, you need to hold up a mirror to your own attitudes, and that's a good thing. But of course, what the police have done, rather than holding up a mirror to their own attitudes, they've simply held up a mirror to our attitudes. They've deflected it entirely. And where Mcpherson was asking them to check their thinking, they've just twisted it to check our thinking. It's a complete and utter perversion of what Mcpherson meant. And when Mcpherson said, police officers, you need to believe reports without evidence, what he meant was, when a black community leader says, look mate, we're getting a lot of problem from this gang or that people or what have you, we're being ignored by the police. What you can't do is go, well, unless you can provide me with the proof, we're not going to take any notice of you. That's what Mcpherson meant. But we've corrupted it to this idea that any perception that anybody has must be believed. Except even that's not true. Because again, all perceptions are equal, but some perceptions are more equal than others. My perception isn't counted for nothing. It doesn't count at all. When I write to the police and say, you carrying that lanyard on your uniform or flying that flag, that offends me, then I'm dismissed. My perception is simply dismissed. But when I make a tweet in favour of women or in favour of keeping the GRA as it is, then the person perceiving me as a hater, that's taken as gospel by the police. So this is where we're at, and it's entirely wrong.
This is all because of protected characteristics, isn't it? I mean, that's what it is that
Well, you say protected characteristic. Of course, the Equality Act 2010 names 9 protected characteristics, but the College of Policing, in their wisdom, have whittled that down to 4 protected characteristics plus 1 made-up one. So we've got gender identity as a protected characteristic or a monitored strand in the College of Policing guidance. That has no basis in law whatsoever, because the protected characteristic is holding or intending to hold a gender recognition certificate. Yeah. So they've taken it upon themselves simply to, we're not bothered about them. We'll cut it down from 9 to 4 and then add 1 that we've made up. This is what the College of Policing do, and that's why they need shutting down.
I think that there is a level of confusion generally now, which resulted. There was a case recently just of it was a rainbow flag sort of billboard, mobile police billboard
on the Wirral.
Yeah, in the Wirral with officers around it, and I think the slogan was something like "Being offensive is an offence" or something like that, which is entirely wrong. And they actually apologised, but the mere fact that they could go out and do this was extraordinary, I thought.
And again, Peter, if it was a bunch of PCSOs had been on a community course and said, okay, you've got the afternoon to go and put something into action, and they'd done that, you could forgive them. But there was an inspector standing with them with a huge great stick, by the way, who thought it was clearly fine. We don't want inspectors who think that you can parade on a 10-foot billboard an out lie. We don't want that.
Well, look, on that note, we'll have to end it. Thank you very, very much, Harry Miller. Thank you, Rafe. And we shall see you next week on Counterculture. But in the meantime, of course, please remember to subscribe, won't you? Very simple. You go to where it says subscribe. It's totally free. Next door, there is that bell. Press on that and you'll get notifications. So I do hope you do that. Thank you once again and see you next week. Bye.